Brave and tenacious, the Crimson Fists have battled the enemies of the Imperium with a stoic ferocity for nigh on 10 millennia. Founded in the wake of the Horus heresy, they are one of several successor chapters of the noble Imperial Fists, and they can trace their genetic legacy back to the Primarch Rogel Dawn, with whom they share their temperament and bearing. Following their creation, the Crimson Fists forged their own destiny, these indomitable, pragmatic and highly skilled warriors carving their names indelibly into Imperial history. They adhere rigidly to the precepts of the Codex Astartes, making a virtue of humility and proudly maintaining the honor and legacy of Rogel Dawn. Throughout the chapter's long and glorious history, the Crimson Fists have become noted for their expertise in fighting the many alien races that assail the Imperium. In particular, they have proven time and again their aptitude for battling the ferocious and bestial orcs. Though originally a fleet-based chapter, the Crimson Fists have become well established as defenders of the Loki sector in the Segmentum Tempestus, where countless orc empires still thrive. While the Crimson Fists have engaged in countless battles against a broad spectrum of opponents across the span of the galaxy, their actions against the orcs have yielded experience and knowledge that has proven vital to humanity. Following the Crimson Fist's successes during the Voltigern Crusade, the High Lords of Terror granted them full feudal rights to Rynn's world. Operating from their newly built fortress monastery, the Crimson Fists launched a brutal campaign that shattered the orc forces across the Loki sector, fracturing the powerful empires into hundreds of disparate, rival warbands that lacked the power to threaten the sector. In the closing stages of the 41st millennium, the orc warlord Snagrod, arch-arsonist of Charadon, launched a massive war that united the warring factions bordering the Loki sector. Pedro Cantor, the chapter master of the Crimson Fists, recalled all of his forces to Rynn's world in preparation for a counter-attack, but no sooner had the companies assembled than War Snagrod reached the Rynn system. The chapter's orbital defenses annihilated the initial waves of orc rocks, cruisers and bomber squadrons. Then tragedy struck when one of the planet's missile augury machine spirits suffered a catastrophic failure. A single plasma warhead tumbled from its plotted trajectory and slammed into the Crimson Fist's fortress monastery. Designed to punch through void shields and bore deep into the dense hulls of warships, the missile ripped its way into the heart of the fortress monastery and detonated within its vast arsenal. Ordnance fit to conquer worlds flashed to annihilating fire in a heartbeat, and the monastery, miles of defenses around it, and 6 full companies of Crimson Fists were erased from existence. Only the handful of space marines manning the outermost perimeter defenses escaped the full fury of the blast. Whether by pure chance or some blessing of the Emperor, those space marines included Pedro Cantor. United by the indomitable will of the chapter master, those survivors managed to battle across the planet through overwhelming numbers of orc invaders to reach the world's capital, New Rynn City. There, they reunited with the battered remnants of the chapter's few remaining companies, who were both shocked and buoyed to find their chapter master still lived. The siege of New Rynn City itself was to grind on for 18 months. Through the inspired leadership of Pedro Cantor, and thanks to the heroic sacrifice of scores of Crimson Fists, the Imperium won out against impossible odds. Wave upon wave of orcs crashed against Cantor's lines, but the Space Marines never wavered, and countless greenskins were brought down by bolter fire. When ammunition ran dry, the orcs fell instead beneath chain blades, combat knives, and ceramite-clad fists. Still the Crimson Fists held firm, channeling in that desperate hour a measure of the close-quarters might of the long-dead Alexis Pollux. The greenskins were finally repulsed from Rynn's world, but the damage had been done. A giant of a man whose great strength belied a coldly logical mind and fierce intellect, Alexis Pollux was the first chapter master of the Crimson Fists. His talents ranged from the vast and terrible ballet of void warfare to the crunching savagery of close combat. Following the Horus heresy and the splitting of the Imperial Fists Legion, Pollux led his chapter for over 8 centuries before his eventual fall in battle. When the Imperial Fists Legion divided into individual chapters after the Horus heresy, the Crimson Fists received the majority of the Legion's most level-headed brethren. Where many of the old legionaries railed against the changes wrought by the implementation of the Codex Astartes, the Crimson Fists embraced them. As a result, the chapter has maintained the combat doctrines set down by Rabute Gilliman before his long sleep in stasis. They train in all of the aspects of war the Adeptus Astartes may face, and can adapt swiftly and smoothly to the varying strategic landscape of any given conflict. The Crimson Fists run endless training exercises and receive subliminal tactical inloads that prepare them to face the many foes the Imperium has encountered. That said, it cannot be ignored that their foremost area of expertise lies in battling orcs. The Crimson Fists have faced every manner of greenskin threat across thousands of war zones in the last 10,000 years, and have developed tried and tested strategies for combating the brutish Xenos. In the wake of the Rynn's world disaster, with their chapter reduced to a shadow of its former strength, the Crimson Fists were forced to adapt their tactics. Their numbers were severely depleted, the majority of their relics and much of their material lost, and they were no longer able to obey the tenets of the Codex Astartes, though this did not stop them attempting to do so wherever possible. The Crimson Fists became adept at fielding their forces in guerrilla actions, infiltrating enemy territory to launch devastating raids against high-priority enemy targets, and setting aside notions of personal glory in favor of completing their missions with the best possible kill-to-casualty ratio. One of the Crimson Fist's primary aims ever since the defeat of Wasnagrod has been the rebuilding of their chapter's numbers. The apothecaries have worked tirelessly to induct new battle brothers from the chapter's traditional recruiting grounds, feral worlds such as Blackwater, Trachan and Fordari too, but it is not a process that can be rushed. Other chapters have made the mistake in the past of compromising the quality of individuals they inducted or gene seed they used to rapidly rebuild their numbers, and cautionary rumors of the dire consequences still circulate amongst the Adeptus Astartes. The Crimson Fists are too measured and methodical to allow such recklessness to endanger their future. But this has meant that, until the coming of the Landomitus Crusade, their climb back from the brink of extinction was extremely slow. Every death, a tragic setback. The Crimson Fists have an extensive calendar of sacred days to honor the Emperor and the Primarch. Amongst these are the Days of Foundation, the Feast of Blades and the Festival of the Bloodied Fist, in which a number of the chapter's promising scouts undergo their final trials before becoming a full battle brother. The last of these trials requires the aspirant to travel to the death world of Blackwater and kill a barb dragon with their bare hands. Those that succeed submerge their left fist into the blood of their prey, symbolizing their right to wear the crimson gauntlet that is the chapter's namesake. Should a battle brother be subsequently promoted to the first company, he will have earned the honor of painting his right gauntlet red as well. A new sacred day has been added to the Crimson Fist's traditions, the Day of Renewal, marking when the chapter and its gene banks were unexpectedly replenished by the Landomitus Crusade. The Crimson Fists renew their vow on this day to repay their debt to the Primarch of the Ultramarines. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing and liking. This helps me make more content from our beloved grim darkness of the far future. For now, let's continue. Pedro Cantor has served as chapter master of the Crimson Fists for almost a century. He first rose to prominence as a sergeant in the Battle of Melchett Sound, where he led the boarding action against the Orc-kill cruiser, De Growler. The cruiser was disabled in the attack, allowing the strike cruiser Crusader to break the Orc line of battle and scatter the Greenskin fleet into the outer system. When Snagrod hit Rynn's world, Cantor was one of a handful of Crimson Fist fortunate enough to survive the fateful missile strike that leveled the chapter's fortress monastery. Cantor witnessed the rippling explosions that tore the heart from his chapter, but stoically set aside his grief to consolidate what power he still commanded. Weighing up his options, Cantor resolved to make for New Rynn City, where a small force of Crimson Fists stood as sentinels alongside the local garrison. The trek took 10 days through a landscape choked with Orc warbands. During the daylight hours, Cantor and his men were forced to seek shelter where they could, lying up against the ruins of an agriplex one day, hiding out in an abandoned quarry the next. Cantor arrived at New Rynn city wearied to the bone, his armor slick with the blood of slain orcs. Scarcely half of the Crimson Fists who had embarked upon the journey survived to reach the city gates, and not a warrior amongst them was unwounded. Still their resolve never wavered. No sooner had Cantor arrived than the Greenskins came to New Rynn city in force. What the orcs found before them was no faltering garrison, but a vengeful and determined force of Space Marines. Under Cantor's unwavering leadership, New Rynn city remained inviolate, and 18 months later it became the staging area for the offensive that drove the orcs from Rynn's world. In the aftermath of the fighting, Cantor was presented with a choice few chapter masters have ever had to make. Rynn's world had been saved, but the Crimson Fists were a shadow of their former glory. He could lead the remnants of his devastated force in a vainglorious last crusade, slaughtering as many foes as possible, but ultimately leaving nothing remaining of the Crimson Fists but epitaphs etched into gold and stone. Or he could marshal his resources and look to the eventual rebuilding of the chapter, though to take such a route would require a truly humbling admission of defeat even in victory. It is to Pedro Cantor's credit, and a mark of his superior character, that he chose the latter path. Since that time, history seems doomed to repeat itself over and over again, the Crimson Fists slowly regaining their strength only to be caught up in yet another brutal war, every loss a terrible blow to the future of the chapter. To Pedro Cantor's credit, he has never once wavered from his chosen path, and he has continued to fight for the survival of his chapter. Following the Noctis Aeterna and the opening of the Great Rift that split the Imperium in two, Cantor and the Crimson Fists found themselves once again besieged upon their home world. The Crimson Fists have fought in many notable conflicts, their honor rolls full of great victories, valorous triumphs against the odds and selfless acts of heroism that have saved billions of lives. Below are recorded but a handful of heroic conflicts from the last 10 millennia. Uralek Prime was the scene of the Crimson Fist's first ever large-scale martial action as a chapter. Though only partial records remain of the battle, it is known that Chapter Master Alexis Pollux led a masterful campaign to liberate the Imperial colony on Uralek Prime. The colonists had come under attack from several fast-moving tribes of Eldari Exodites, who hit them again and again with remarkable ferocity. The Xenos were determined to eradicate every last human on the face of the planet. The Crimson Fists were equally as determined that they would not succeed. During the early stages of the conflict, the chapter's partially recovered histories suggest that Pollux relied heavily upon his orbital superiority, laying waste to great swathes of the lush forests that gave the Exodites cover and facilitated their hit-and-run tactics. With his enemies flushed out into the open, Pollux led a series of textbook drop assaults that saw the Exodite tribes smashed and scattered. Those Xenos that broke through to the colony's defenses found themselves faced by the superior firepower of Crimson Fists, Devastator squads and battle tanks, and were rapidly cut to pieces. Though the Space Marines' casualties were not insignificant, the Eldari were utterly devastated, and the colony on Uralek Prime freed to flourish into a world-spanning civilization. In the 32nd millennium, the Imperium came under threat from the largest orc war ever encountered. Led by a war boss known only as the Beast, the Imperium, still recovering from the Horus heresy, was plunged into a fight for survival once more. On Ardamantua, the Imperial Fists, gene-sires of the Crimson Fists, battled the Beast's colossal armies and were virtually wiped out. The last surviving Imperial Fist, Captain Kurland, enacted the Last Wall Protocol, calling for the successor chapters of the Imperial Fists to be reunited once more. The Crimson Fists joined the Black Templars, Fists Exemplar, Iron Knights and Excoriators in the defense of Terra as an Orc attack moon entered the Sol system. A huge assault was launched on the moon, and the Orc onslaught was defeated. Following the successful defense of Terra, the Crimson Fists joined the crusade to Ulanor, the planet where the Beast made its lair. Chapter Master Uesadra of the Crimson Fists was among the many warriors killed by the Beast during the fighting, and though the leader of the Orcs was supposedly slain by the Primarch Vulcan, the war with the Greenskins continued for several more years. Kurland was killed during the war, and with him the Imperial Fists chapter died. The Crimson Fists, alongside their fellow successor chapters, donated a portion of their strength to rebuild their parent chapter. During the era of dark omens that preceded the coming of the Great Rift, the Khornate warlord Torkvar the Dread invaded the Lernoth system. Leading a brutal warband of renegade space marines known as the Gorehounds, Torkvar ripped through the Astra Militarum regiments defending the industrial world of Lernoth IV, and spread a blood madness that saw trillions of its laborers degenerate into frenzied killers. Into this cauldron of carnage plunged a force of just 30 Crimson Fists, led by the tactically brilliant Captain Julius, and provided with very specific mission parameters. Julius's entire force was made up of veteran battle brothers and specialist tech marines, who swiftly went to ground amidst the madness engulfing Lernoth IV and put their plans in motion. Utilizing a series of kill-team strikes against key targets, the Crimson Fists steadily destabilized the thermal macro-reactors that governed the planet's continent-sized tank manufacturer. Though hunted constantly by their Khornate foes, the Crimson Fists fought only those battles they had to, ensuring that every blow they struck was a telling one. 6 months after arriving on Lernoth IV, the surviving 2/3 of the Crimson Fist strike force were extracted via Stormraven gunship, fighting a last furious battle as they made their escape. In their wake, Torkvar and his chosen champions were left crowing of the cowardice and weakness of Imperial warriors. Their bragging was cut short, however, when the critically destabilized reactors detonated in a vicious chain reaction that scoured 86% of all life from the planet's surface. Only when the firestorms had died down did the Adeptus Mechanicus Reclamation Force make planetfall, easily gunning down the last of the Chaos forces and reclaiming the subterranean riches of the planet for their own. The tale of Traitor's Gorge is one known only to Pedro Cantor and the warriors who fought at his side that fateful day in the Jaden Mountains. Although the planet was officially designated as secured, isolated pockets of greenskins still held out in the wilderness. Several warbands were known to be lurking in the Jaden Mountains, launching raids that the beleaguered populace of Rynn's world could ill afford. Pedro Cantor himself chose to lead the campaign to purge the greenskins from their mountain fastnesses, taking an understrength force of Crimson Fists into a battle for every crag and cavern. His foes were tenacious, and their numbers far in excess of even the most pessimistic predictions. Stirred to fury by Cantor's purge, the Orc warbands united into a single force that assailed the Space Marines in Traitor's Gorge. Though only 24 in number, the Crimson Fists fought like heroes of legend and reaped a tally of greenskin lives before being forced to retreat. Officially, Cantor and his warriors overcame the odds with a heroism that would have gladdened the Emperor himself to see, repelling the Orcs' assault before pursuing their broken foes back. When the Great Rift ripped across the galaxy, Rynn's world found itself far to the galactic south of the primary anomaly. This did not save the planet from an outbreak of unregulated psychic phenomena and warp storm activity. The demon Prince Raxa, a warlord of terrible might, assailed the Crimson Fist's homeworld, and the chapter, barely restored to half strength, faced annihilation all over again. In their darkest hour, however, the Crimson Fists were saved from annihilation by the arrival of the Indomitus Crusade. Roboute Guilliman himself led the relief of Rynn's world, linking his forces to the surviving Crimson Fists and the Rynsgard Planetary Defense Force, before working with Pedro Cantor seemingly as equals to coordinate the annihilation of the demonic menace. In the wake of the planet's second salvation, Archmagus Call's freighter hulk delivered an equal measure of redemption to the Crimson Fists themselves in the form of company after company of Primaris battle brothers. The technologies to fashion new Primaris warriors were gifted to the Crimson Fists Apothecarian, and hope kindled anew in the hearts of those battle brothers who had survived the demonic invasion of their world. In the aftermath of the battles, Pedro Cantor had much to do. The demons had brought ruin to much of the planet. The chapter so painstakingly rebuilt was once more decimated. Its numbers would swiftly be replenished by a great influx of Primaris Space Marines from the holds of Archmagus Call's ship. But these warriors, potent and timely reinforcements though they were, had never known Rynn's world, and did not appreciate the chapter's rituals. They required swift cultural integration to ensure that, like a wounded body fitted with a hurried prosthetic, the chapter did not reject these newcomers for the strangers they were. As awed by Roboute Guilliman as Pedro Cantor was, the chapter master of the Crimson Fists was simply too overstretched to do more than thank the Lord Commander of the Imperium for his timely arrival. Meanwhile, equally pressed for time, Guilliman spent but 3 days on Rynn's world, as his crusade refitted itself. Before he left, Guilliman summoned Pedro Cantor. Arriving late and still in the same uncleansed battle garb, the chapter master felt trepidation as he stood before the Primarch. Guilliman, who did not miss much, instantly read Cantor's discomfort. For the first time in months, the Primarch laughed, not out of spite, but astonished mirth. "Be at ease, chapter master," he said. "I have not summoned you for censure, but to speak earnestly. Rogel Dawn thought there was no higher purpose to the existence of the Adeptus Astartes than the unification of mankind. I see that in you also, and his determination. I need warriors who fight bravely even when faced with great tragedy. I have seen with my own eyes how you inspire intense loyalty in those around you, and I see you hold duty above glory or vengeance. My brother would be proud. Reassemble your chapter, Pedro Cantor, and look now to the future rather than the past. The Loki system and the Imperium entire has need of you." This speech inspired Cantor beyond the ability of words to describe. The thought that his genocide would have approved his choices stilled many questions that had long churned in his mind, and he set about the restoration of the Crimson Fists with a will. Yet the galaxy does not stand still. The war for the survival of humanity raged on, and with the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Imperium's battlefields had redoubled, and its plight become more desperate than ever before. Even as he worked to build his chapter's numbers back to full strength, and to integrate the Primaris Space Marines into the Crimson Fists ranks, Cantor ordered other plans set in motion, some of which he had discussed with Guilliman on the day of the Primarch's departure. The turbulent years of destruction and the long, slow fight to rebuild had left the Crimson Fists with a greater-than-normal strength of veteran warriors, whose expertise was now desperately needed amongst beset neighbouring systems. Cantor therefore authorised the deployment of veteran kill teams to nearby war zones. Their duty was either to escort tech marines and apothecaries while they aided local Imperial forces, or else to strike carefully aimed blows to destabilise enemy forces, remove tyrannical war leaders from power and the like. For the first time in many decades, the Crimson Fists were able to dispatch a substantial number of veteran Xenos hunters to join the ranks of the Death Watch, sharing their invaluable orc hunting expertise with their fellow Space Marine chapters. Cantor also wasted no time in dispatching strike forces to worlds that seemed in the greatest need of aid. Provided with such a sudden replenishment of martial strength after so many years of hand-to-mouth survival, some chapters might have charged recklessly into every battle they could find, feeling the need to prove their worth anew or exercise a long-felt desire for vengeance. Not so the Crimson Fists. Pedro Cantor's deployment of his warriors was measured, carefully planned, and meticulously orchestrated. Crimson Fist strike forces arrived upon Vigilas, plunged into Warzone Riza, and initiated hammerblow offensives upon half a dozen worlds in the Loki sector. Always they deployed just enough strength to ensure the maximum conquest-to-casualty ratio. Always they struck at the most strategically consequential targets. Always they demonstrated that long years of hardship had taught the Crimson Fists how to husband their strength and fight without ego or undue optimism. They must get the absolute most out of every shot fired, every blow struck, every warrior deployed before falling back the moment victory threatened to become Pyrrhic. With each victory, the Crimson Fists removed another greenskin infestation, another demonically possessed rogue governor or alien despot from power, and strengthened the Imperium's hold upon the Loki sector. Such was Guilliman's command to Pedro Cantor, the last words he had spoken to him before boarding his transport and continuing about his long crusade.
Make of this sector a fortress, untouched by alien hand, untainted by the touch of the ruinous powers. Create a stronghold of Imperial space that, in direst need, can become the linchpin of the entire segmentum. Lay low the works of the tyrant and the despot, Pedro Cantor. and in their place raise fortifications of adamantine and ceramite, so that, in our darkest hour, you might do for the segmentum tempestus what you have done for your noble chapter.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below.